The idea that consciousness might not end with physical death has haunted human thought since the earliest civilizations, appearing in myths, religions, philosophies, and more recently in speculative science. Yet few concepts are as unsettling and as fascinating as the theory known as quantum immortality, a hypothesis born from interpretations of quantum mechanics and the multiverse that suggests that subjective experience may never encounter its own termination, but instead continuously transitions into alternate realities where survival occurs, creating the eerie possibility that from the inside perspective, the self may experience an endless chain of continued existence, even as countless versions of the body perish across parallel universes. To grasp this notion, one must first understand the foundations of quantum theory that gave rise to it, particularly the many worlds interpretation, which proposes that every quantum event that has multiple possible outcomes does not resolve into a single result, but rather branches the universe into distinct realities where each possibility is realized, meaning that every choice, every chance occurrence, and every microscopic interaction splits existence into countless parallel timelines, each as real as the one we perceive, yet inaccessible to one another. Within this framework, the unsettling implication emerges that when a life-threatening event occurs, such as a fatal accident, a terminal illness, or any moment where death is one possible outcome among others, there will exist branches of reality where the individual dies, and at least one branch where the individual survives, no matter how improbable that survival may be, and if consciousness follows only the path in which it continues to exist, then subjectively the person never experiences death, but instead always finds themselves in the version of reality where they lived, leading to the illusion of immortality from the first-person perspective. Imagine standing at a crosswalk as a car speeds toward you. In most timelines, you are struck and killed, but in one improbable branch, the car swerves at the last moment, or you stumble backward just in time, and your awareness continues in that surviving branch, with no access to the countless realities where you cease to exist, leaving you with the impression of having narrowly escaped death, perhaps repeatedly throughout your life, without ever perceiving the outcomes where you did not. Supporters of quantum immortality argue that over the span of a lifetime, such near-death escapes would accumulate, forming a pattern where improbable survivals become increasingly common from the subjective viewpoint, even as objectively, across the multiverse, death occurs in the vast majority of branches, suggesting that consciousness is effectively biased towards survival simply because it can only be experienced where survival happens. This idea challenges the most fundamental assumptions about mortality, identity, and the nature of reality itself, forcing us to confront the possibility that what we call death may be something that always happens to others, to alternate versions of ourselves, but never to the experiencing self, raising disturbing philosophical questions about what it truly means to exist, to persist, and to be aware. If consciousness indeed continues along the surviving branches indefinitely, one must then ask what happens as time progresses, as the body ages, weakens, and accumulates damage. Because even if improbable survival events continue to occur, eventually one would expect to reach states of extreme injury, illness, or decay, where only the most fantastical outcomes allow continued life, potentially leading to realities where medical miracles occur repeatedly, where unlikely recoveries become the norm, or where the laws of probability seem to bend endlessly to preserve awareness. This leads to the haunting possibility that subjective immortality might not resemble eternal youth or perfect health, but rather an ongoing sequence of increasingly improbable escapes, where one survives events that should have been fatal again and again, perhaps experiencing realities where experimental treatments succeed against all odds, where accidents that should have destroyed the body somehow leave it intact, or where sudden recoveries defy medical explanation. Critics of the theory point out that quantum mechanics operates on microscopic scales, and that applying its principles directly to macroscopic events like human survival is speculative at best. Yet proponents counter that if reality fundamentally obeys quantum rules at every level, then even large-scale phenomena must ultimately be subject to branching outcomes, even if the probabilities are unimaginably small. Beyond the physics, the concept opens a vast philosophical landscape, particularly regarding personal identity across universes. Because if countless versions of you exist, diverging slightly with every moment, which one is truly you? And what does it mean for consciousness to select one branch over another? Or is it simply that awareness exists wherever the brain remains functional, creating the illusion of a single continuous self moving through time, while in truth there are infinite parallel selves, living out slightly different lives? Some philosophers argue that quantum immortality relies on a flawed understanding of subjective experience, suggesting that while there may be branches where survival occurs, there is no mechanism that guarantees consciousness will always align with those branches, and that from a holistic perspective, death is still the overwhelmingly likely outcome across the multiverse, even if individual awareness cannot perceive its own absence. Others contend that the theory may be unfalsifiable, since any person who dies cannot report their experience, and those who survive will naturally interpret their survival as evidence of continuation, creating a cognitive bias where only the surviving perspectives remain to tell the story, much like survivorship bias in statistics, where outcomes that fail are invisible to observation. Yet, despite these objections, the emotional and existential pull of the idea remains powerful, particularly when people recall moments in their lives when they narrowly avoided disaster, accidents that should have ended in tragedy but somehow did not, illnesses that resolved unexpectedly, or circumstances where chance seemed to intervene in their favor, fostering the intuitive feeling that something guided them away from death. This intuition has long existed in human culture, often attributed to fate, divine intervention, guardian angels, or destiny. But quantum immortality reframes it in scientific language, replacing supernatural protection with probabilistic branching, where survival does not require purpose or intention, only the existence of at least one possible path where life continues. If this perspective is correct, then the universe is constantly splitting into unimaginably many realities, most of which contain versions of people who die at various points, while a tiny subset contains versions who persist longer and longer. And it is only those persisting versions who continue to experience the flow of time, giving rise to the unsettling notion that from inside consciousness, existence may feel unbreakable even as it is repeatedly extinguished elsewhere. This also leads to disturbing implications about risk, because if one truly believed in quantum immortality, they might be tempted to engage in dangerous behavior under the assumption that they will always find themselves in the branch where they survive. Yet from an external perspective, such actions would still result in death in nearly all realities, causing harm to countless versions of loved ones who would experience loss and grief, while only one improbable survivor continues onward. Furthermore, the theory raises questions about aging and the ultimate fate of the universe, because if consciousness keeps following survival branches, what happens when the universe itself reaches heat, death, collapse, or some catastrophic end? Would there always be some branch where conditions allow continued existence, perhaps through advanced technology, digital consciousness, or transitions into entirely new forms of being? Or would subjective experience eventually encounter a limit beyond which no survival is possible? Some speculative thinkers suggest that quantum immortality might connect with ideas of mind uploading, artificial intelligence, or simulated realities, proposing that as biological survival becomes increasingly unlikely, consciousness may persist through technological means in branches where such advancements succeed, leading to a form of effective immortality where awareness transitions from organic to synthetic substrates while still experiencing continuity of self. Others push the concept even further, imagining that consciousness might not be strictly tied to the physical brain at all, but rather be a fundamental aspect of reality akin to energy or information, capable of reorganizing itself across different structures, bodies, or even universes, meaning the death of the physical form is merely a transformation point rather than an endpoint. This intersects with various theories of consciousness in neuroscience and philosophy, such as panpsychism, which posits that consciousness is a fundamental feature of all matter, or theories that view awareness as an emergent process that could arise wherever sufficient complexity exists, opening the possibility that subjective experience might continue in entirely different forms beyond biological life. If such perspectives hold any truth, quantum immortality may be only one piece of a much larger puzzle regarding the persistence of awareness, suggesting that the self we identify with may be far more resilient and adaptable than we currently understand, capable of navigating not only parallel universes, but entirely different modes of existence. However, even without invoking these more speculative ideas, the basic premise of quantum immortality already forces a profound re-evaluation of death, transforming it from an absolute endpoint into a relative phenomenon that occurs in most branches of reality but may never be encountered subjectively, a concept that is both comforting and deeply unsettling at the same time. Comforting because it suggests that from the inside perspective, one might never truly cease to be, always awakening in a reality where life continues, but unsettling because it implies endless exposure to increasingly extreme circumstances, improbable survivals, and perhaps eventual isolation in realities vastly different from the familiar world we know today. It also introduces ethical and emotional complexities regarding relationships, because while one version of you might survive, countless others would die, leaving behind families, friends, and communities in mourning across infinite universes, while you continue onward unaware of the suffering your alternate deaths have caused. In this sense, quantum immortality paints a universe that is both infinitely abundant and infinitely tragic, where every possible story unfolds somewhere, including countless stories of loss, grief, and premature endings, even as a thin thread of continuing awareness weaves its way through improbable survival after survival. As we continue exploring this concept, we will delve deeper into the scientific foundations that support or challenge it, examine thought experiments designed to illustrate its implications, analyze criticisms from physicists and philosophers, and consider what this theory means for our understanding of fear, meaning, and the value of life itself. Because whether quantum immortality is true or not, the questions it raises strike at the core of what it means to be conscious in a vast and mysterious universe. In the next part, we will explore the famous quantum suicide thought experiment that brought this idea into serious philosophical discussion, unpack how it is supposed to demonstrate subjective immortality, and examine why it remains one of the most controversial and debated scenarios in modern theoretical physics and philosophy of mind. To understand how the idea of quantum immortality gained traction beyond abstract speculation, it is essential to examine the thought experiment known as quantum suicide, which was proposed as a dramatic illustration of how the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics might intersect with subjective experience, offering a scenario where the observer appears to survive every time, despite overwhelming odds of death from an external perspective. The experiment imagines a device connected to a quantum system, such as a particle whose state is fundamentally random until measured, and that upon each measurement, the device either harmlessly clicks or instantly kills the observer depending on the outcome, with a 50% probability for each result, so that from the viewpoint of an external observer, half the time the person dies and half the time they live. But according to many worlds, the universe splits into two branches each time, one where the observer dies and one where they survive. If the experiment is repeated over and over, external observers would see the person die almost immediately in most branches, since the probability of surviving many consecutive rounds drops exponentially. Yet from the subjective perspective of the observer, consciousness would only ever exist in the branches where survival occurs, leading them to experience an unbroken sequence of clicks without death, even after dozens or hundreds of trials that should have made survival virtually impossible. This thought experiment was never intended to be performed in reality, both for obvious ethical reasons and because it relies on idealized assumptions about quantum systems. Yet it powerfully illustrates the strange implication that from inside awareness, one might never encounter the outcome of death, no matter how likely it becomes across the multiverse. Supporters of quantum immortality argue that everyday life may function in a similar way, though with vastly more complex probability structures, where every dangerous situation is analogous to a quantum measurement with multiple outcomes, most leading to death and a few leading to survival, with consciousness continuing only in the latter, creating the subjective impression of repeated lucky escapes. Critics respond that this interpretation misunderstands how probability works in the many worlds framework, pointing out that while all outcomes occur, they are not equally weighted, and that most branches contain dead observers, meaning that from a universal perspective, death overwhelmingly dominates, and the surviving branches are extremely rare. Yet rarity does not negate subjective continuity, because awareness can only be present where the brain remains functional. So even if 99.9999% of branches end in death, the remaining fraction still contains a conscious observer who experiences continued life. And from within that perspective, the overwhelming majority of outcomes are simply invisible. This leads to the strange asymmetry between first-person experience and third-person statistics, where objectively, almost every version of a person dies quickly, yet subjectively the person may experience indefinite survival, a disconnect that challenges our intuitions about probability, observation, and what it means to measure outcomes in a multiverse. The implications of this asymmetry extend far beyond theoretical physics, touching deeply on psychology and human perception, because our brains are naturally wired to interpret survival as normal and death as something that happens to others, reinforcing the intuitive feeling that we are somehow exempt from the finality we observe all around us. This psychological phenomenon, often called the personal immortality bias, has been documented in studies where people consistently underestimate their own likelihood of dying compared to statistical averages, even when presented with clear evidence of risk, suggesting that the mind has an inherent resistance to imagining its own non-existence. Quantum immortality appears to offer a scientific narrative that aligns with this deep-seated intuition, giving it a cosmological explanation rather than a purely cognitive one, proposing that perhaps the reason we cannot imagine our own absence is because we never subjectively experience it. Yet this alignment may also be precisely what makes the theory so seductive and potentially misleading, because it resonates with our emotional desires for continuity, survival, and meaning, which could bias us toward accepting speculative interpretations that offer comfort or mystery, rather than sober realism. Physicists who are skeptical of the concept emphasize that the many worlds interpretation itself is only one of several competing explanations of quantum mechanics, and that there is no experimental evidence currently capable of confirming the literal existence of branching universes, making any conclusions drawn from it highly speculative. Other interpretations, such as the Copenhagen interpretation or objective collapse theories, do not involve universe splitting, and therefore offer no basis for quantum immortality, instead treating quantum probabilities as inherent randomness that resolves into a single outcome when measured, meaning that death would occur definitively without any surviving parallel branches. Even within many worlds, some researchers argue that consciousness should not be treated as something that selects branches, but rather as an emergent process occurring independently in each branch, with no privileged continuity from one to another, suggesting that while multiple versions of you exist, there is no single stream of awareness hopping between universes. From this perspective, the sense of continuous self is simply a local phenomenon within each branch, and when that branch ends in death, the consciousness in that branch ends as well, regardless of the existence of other branches where different versions continue, undermining the notion of subjective immortality. This raises the deeper philosophical issue of what constitutes personal identity, because if countless copies of you exist with identical memories up to a certain point, are they all equally you? Or is there something unique about the particular stream of experience you inhabit, and if that stream ends, does the continuation of similar streams elsewhere truly count as survival? Some philosophers argue that identity is not a single continuous thread, but rather a pattern of psychological continuity, meaning that any future being with your memories, personality, and experiences could be considered a continuation of you, even if physically distinct, which would support the idea that surviving copies in other branches are indeed you, in a meaningful sense. Others insist that subjective continuity is essential, and that without a direct experiential link, the existence of identical copies elsewhere does not preserve the original self, much like how a perfect clone created today would not mean that you personally experience its future life if you were to die tomorrow. This debate mirrors discussions in thought experiments about teleportation, brain duplication, and mind uploading, where the core question is whether copying consciousness preserves identity or merely creates a new individual with similar characteristics. Quantum immortality effectively extends this dilemma to a cosmic scale, where duplication occurs constantly across branching universes, forcing us to confront whether survival requires physical continuity, psychological similarity, or something else entirely. If survival requires uninterrupted subjective experience, then quantum immortality becomes much harder to justify, because there is no clear mechanism by which consciousness would preferentially follow surviving branches, rather than simply ending in those where death occurs. If, however, survival is defined by the continued existence of a psychologically continuous version of oneself somewhere in the multiverse, then immortality becomes almost trivial, since countless such versions would exist at all times, regardless of what happens in any particular branch. Yet this looser definition of survival may not provide the comfort people seek, because knowing the copies of you exist elsewhere does not necessarily alleviate the fear of your own subjective end. Just as knowing that future generations of humans will live on does not remove the inevitability of your personal death. The true unsettling power of quantum immortality lies precisely in the stronger claim of uninterrupted subjective continuity, the idea that you will always find yourself alive, no matter what happens, which transforms death from a universal certainty into a phenomenon that is endlessly postponed from the first-person view. This raises another disturbing possibility, that consciousness might eventually find itself in increasingly alien realities, where survival has only occurred through extreme and improbable circumstances, potentially leading to worlds radically different from our own. For example, as medical technology advances, one might survive injuries that would have been fatal in earlier eras, continuing into futures where life extension, cybernetic enhancements, or digital consciousness become commonplace, gradually transitioning the human experience into forms that would seem like science fiction today. In branches where such technologies fail, death would occur, but in those where they succeed, consciousness would continue, biasing subjective experience toward increasingly technologically advanced worlds over time. This could create the impression of a personal timeline that always seems to progress toward greater survival capability, even as most realities do not achieve such outcomes, effectively funneling awareness into the narrow set of universes where life preservation continually improves. Some speculative thinkers describe this as a form of anthropic selection, where observers naturally find themselves in realities compatible with their continued existence, similar to how we observe a universe capable of supporting life because we could not exist in one that does not. Quantum immortality would then be an extreme version of this principle, where consciousness only ever experiences realities compatible with its ongoing survival. However, critics argue that this reasoning conflates observation with causation, noting that while we can only observe conditions that allow our existence, this does not imply that those conditions will persist indefinitely, nor that awareness is guaranteed to continue through increasingly unlikely scenarios. At some point, they argue, probabilities become so vanishingly small that treating survival as effectively impossible is reasonable, even within a multiverse framework, though proponents counter that in an infinite multiverse, even infinitesimal probabilities will be realized somewhere. This tension between mathematical possibility and experiential plausibility remains one of the central controversies surrounding the theory, highlighting the limits of applying abstract infinity to lived experience. As we move forward, the question becomes not only whether quantum immortality is scientifically valid, but what it reveals about how humans grapple with mortality, uncertainty, and the vastness of reality, because even if the theory is ultimately false, it serves as a powerful lens through which to examine our fears, hopes, and intuitions about existence. In the next section, we will explore how this concept intersects with modern theories of consciousness, near-death experiences, and reports of altered states of awareness, examining whether subjective phenomena offer any clues, however tentative, about the possibility of awareness persisting beyond physical death. As the discussion of quantum immortality extends beyond physics into the realm of consciousness studies, it inevitably intersects with centuries-old questions about the nature of awareness itself, because the theory implicitly assumes that consciousness is something that can persist, relocate, or continue under certain conditions, rather than being strictly bound to a single physical process that ends irreversibly with the death of the brain. Modern neuroscience typically views consciousness as an emergent phenomenon arising from complex neural activity, with specific patterns of electrical and chemical signaling giving rise to perception, memory, and the sense of self, suggesting that when the brain ceases to function, subjective experience should likewise cease, much like a flame going out when its fuel is exhausted. Yet despite decades of research, the precise mechanism by which physical processes give rise to subjective experience remains one of the greatest mysteries in science, often referred to as the hard problem of consciousness, because no amount of objective measurement seems capable of fully explaining why certain arrangements of matter produce the rich inner world of thoughts, emotions, and awareness that we experience. This explanatory gap has led some researchers and philosophers to propose that consciousness may not be merely a byproduct of brain activity, but rather a fundamental feature of reality, perhaps analogous to space, time, or energy, which could interact with physical systems without being entirely reducible to them. If consciousness is indeed fundamental, it may not be strictly limited to a single brain or even a single universe, opening the door to the possibility that awareness could reorganize itself across different physical substrates, whether biological, technological, or something entirely unknown, lending a form of plausibility to ideas like quantum immortality or post-mortem continuation. One framework that resonates with this notion is panpsychism, the view that all matter possesses some form of rudimentary consciousness or experiential quality, meaning that the universe itself is infused with proto-awareness, and complex beings like humans are simply highly organized expressions of this underlying conscious fabric. Under such a view, death would not represent the annihilation of consciousness, but rather the dissolution of a particular organized pattern of experience, with awareness potentially reconfiguring into new forms elsewhere, much as a wave dissipates in one place while energy continues to move through the ocean. While panpsychism remains controversial, it has gained renewed interest in recent years as a serious philosophical position, partly because it offers a potential solution to the hard problem by treating consciousness as a basic property rather than something that must emerge inexplicably from non-conscious matter. Another line of thought comes from theories that view consciousness as fundamentally tied to information processing, suggesting that wherever sufficiently complex information structures exist, subjective experience may arise regardless of the physical medium in which those structures are implemented. This perspective supports the possibility that consciousness could exist in artificial systems, such as advanced computers or neural simulations, and potentially be transferred or copied, blurring the boundary between biological life and technological continuation. If awareness can indeed arise in multiple substrates, then survival after biological death might not require a mystical leap across universes, but could occur through processes like mind uploading, digital preservation, or the spontaneous emergence of similar cognitive structures in other realities. Quantum immortality, in this broader context, may represent only one potential pathway for continuity of experience, with technology-driven survival being another, and both raising profound ethical and philosophical questions about identity, personhood, and what it means to remain oneself over time. However, these speculative ideas remain far from empirical validation, and many neuroscientists caution against extrapolating beyond the available evidence, emphasizing that all known instances of consciousness are currently associated with living brains, and that damage to specific neural regions can dramatically alter or eliminate subjective experience. Cases of severe brain injury, neurodegenerative disease, and anesthesia-induced unconsciousness all suggest a tight coupling between physical brain states and awareness, reinforcing the view that consciousness depends critically on biological processes. Yet even within this framework, there are phenomena that continue to puzzle researchers, particularly near-death experiences reported by individuals who were clinically close to death or temporarily lacked measurable brain activity, describing vivid perceptions, feelings of detachment from the body, encounters with light or deceased relatives, and a profound sense of continuity beyond physical life. While many scientists attribute these experiences to neurochemical processes, oxygen deprivation, or the brain's attempt to construct coherent narratives under extreme stress, others note that some reports include verifiable details about events occurring during unconsciousness, which has fueled ongoing debate about whether awareness might persist in some form, even when the brain is severely compromised. Though near-death experiences do not provide concrete proof of consciousness surviving death, they illustrate how the subjective sense of self can feel strikingly real and continuous even under conditions where normal brain function is disrupted, suggesting that our understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the body may be incomplete. For proponents of quantum immortality, such phenomena are sometimes interpreted as glimpses of transitions between states of existence, moments where awareness approaches the threshold of physical death, but somehow returns, possibly aligning with the idea of shifting into surviving branches of reality. Critics argue that this interpretation stretches the evidence far beyond what it can support, pointing out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that psychological and neurological explanations remain far more parsimonious. Nevertheless, the persistence of these experiences across cultures and historical periods underscores humanity's deep fascination with what lies beyond death, and the enduring intuition that consciousness may not be easily extinguished. Another intriguing aspect of subjective experience relevant to quantum immortality is the phenomenon of time perception, particularly how consciousness can feel continuous even when interrupted by sleep, anesthesia, or brief loss of awareness, creating the impression of seamless existence despite actual gaps in experience. When you fall asleep and wake up hours later, you do not experience the passage of unconsciousness as a void of non-existence, but rather as an instantaneous transition from one moment to the next, which some argue mirrors how death might subjectively feel if awareness were to continue elsewhere. If consciousness were to cease completely with no continuation, there would be no experience of that cessation, only the last moment before it, whereas if awareness were to resume in some other context, it might feel like an immediate transition, reinforcing the illusion of uninterrupted existence. This perspective aligns with the idea that subjective experience cannot perceive its own absence, making it impossible to ever feel non-existence, which in turn supports the intuitive sense that one will always find oneself experiencing something rather than nothing. From this angle, quantum immortality may be less about literal universe hopping and more about the fundamental structure of consciousness, which is inherently incapable of experiencing its own termination, meaning that from the inside perspective, existence always appears to continue, regardless of what happens physically. However, this does not necessarily imply actual survival, only that subjective experience is bounded by moments of awareness and cannot encompass the state of non-awareness that follows death, much like a movie that ends without showing the blank screen afterward. Still, when combined with multiverse theories, this limitation of perception takes on a more radical interpretation, suggesting not only that one cannot experience death, but that one always transitions into a state where experience persists. This convergence of physics, neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology illustrates why quantum immortality remains such a captivating yet controversial idea, sitting at the intersection of what we know, what we can imagine, and what we deeply wish or fear might be true. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about whether our sense of a single, continuous life is an illusion created by selective awareness, whether countless unseen versions of ourselves live and die across realities, and whether the story we experience is merely one thread in an unimaginably vast tapestry of existence. Moreover, it challenges the finality that gives life much of its urgency and meaning, because if death is not truly the end from the subjective perspective, then the stakes of existence may be fundamentally different than we assume, potentially altering how we view risk, morality, and the preciousness of time. Some philosophers argue that even if quantum immortality were true, it would not diminish the value of life in each branch, because suffering, joy, and relationships are experienced fully within each reality, and the fact that other versions exist elsewhere does not negate the importance of the experiences here and now. Others worry that the belief in subjective immortality could lead to reckless behavior or existential detachment, where individuals feel less accountable for their actions or less concerned about consequences, assuming that they will always continue in some surviving reality. These ethical concerns highlight the practical implications of how we interpret speculative theories, emphasizing the need to balance curiosity about cosmic possibilities with responsibility grounded in the lived world we inhabit. As we approach the final part of this exploration, the focus shifts toward the broader existential consequences of quantum immortality, examining how such a worldview might reshape our understanding of purpose, fear, hope, and what it ultimately means to live a finite or infinite life within a vast multiverse. As the implications of quantum immortality unfold, they inevitably lead us toward deeper existential territory, where the boundaries between science, philosophy, and human meaning begin to blur. Because whether the theory is ultimately proven true, partially true, or entirely speculative, it offers a powerful framework through which to examine our relationship with mortality and the unknown. For most of human history, death has been understood as the great equalizer, the unavoidable endpoint that gives urgency to life and frames every experience within the finite window of existence, shaping cultures, religions, and personal values around the awareness that time is limited. Quantum immortality, by contrast, proposes a radically different narrative, one in which death is not an absolute conclusion, but a branching event, a divergence where most versions of the self end while a tiny fraction continue, creating the unsettling possibility that from within consciousness, the journey never truly stops. If this were the case, the fear of non-existence that haunts human thought might be misplaced, because the subjective experience of nothingness would never occur, replaced instead by continuous transitions into new moments of awareness, however improbable their circumstances might be. Yet this does not necessarily offer comfort, because an endless sequence of survival could entail enduring extreme situations, prolonged suffering, or realities increasingly distant from the familiar human world, raising the question of whether immortality, even subjective immortality, is something to be desired. Stories throughout history have warned about the burden of eternal life, portraying immortals who grow weary, isolated, or trapped in cycles of loss as everyone around them ages and dies, suggesting that finitude may be an essential component of meaning and emotional richness. Quantum immortality amplifies this dilemma on a cosmic scale, because rather than living forever in a single world, one would persist across a succession of worlds, potentially watching countless versions of loved ones perish in other branches while continuing onward alone in improbable survivors. This paints a vision of existence that is both infinite and deeply lonely, where awareness drifts through realities connected only by memory, carrying the weight of continuity while everything else fragments endlessly around it. At the same time, one could imagine the opposite outcome, where continued survival leads into ever more advanced civilizations, greater understanding, and expanded forms of consciousness, where suffering diminishes and the universe becomes a place of exploration rather than fear. In this optimistic scenario, subjective immortality would act as a funnel, guiding awareness toward realities where intelligence and technology consistently overcome existential threats, creating a personal trajectory that appears almost purposefully progressive, even if driven purely by probabilistic selection. Such a path might culminate in forms of existence far beyond current human comprehension, perhaps as integrated networks of minds, digital universes, or states of awareness woven directly into the fabric of reality itself. Yet whether this vision is utopian or dystopian depends entirely on the nature of the surviving branches and the experiences they contain, which remain unknowable and speculative. What quantum immortality undeniably does is challenge the assumption that death is the ultimate horizon of experience, inviting us to consider that consciousness might operate under rules very different from those governing physical matter alone. Even if the theory is incorrect in its literal interpretation, it highlights a profound truth about subjective experience, that we never perceive our own absence, only the presence of awareness in each moment, creating the continuous narrative we call life. This alone may explain why death feels so abstract and unreal until it happens to others, why the mind struggles to truly grasp the concept of non-existence, and why stories of afterlife, reincarnation, and continuation appear in virtually every culture. Quantum immortality can thus be seen not only as a physical hypothesis, but as a modern expression of humanity's timeless search for meaning beyond mortality, reframed through the language of quantum mechanics and multiverse theory rather than mythology and theology. It reflects our desire to believe that the self is more than a fragile biological process, that awareness holds some deeper significance within the cosmos, and that existence is not so easily erased. At the same time, it confronts us with the unsettling vastness of reality, where countless versions of ourselves may live and die unseen, where every choice and chance event spawns entire worlds of consequences beyond our perception. This perspective can inspire humility, reminding us that our lived experience is only one thread among infinite possibilities, and that the universe may be far richer and more complex than any single narrative can capture. It can also inspire awe, encouraging a sense of wonder at the mysterious processes that give rise to consciousness and the intricate structures of reality that allow experience to emerge at all. Ultimately, whether quantum immortality is a literal truth or a provocative thought experiment, its greatest value may lie in the questions it forces us to ask about what it means to be alive, what it means to be aware, and how we should live knowing that our understanding of existence is still so incomplete. If there is even a remote possibility that consciousness persists in ways we do not yet comprehend, it invites us to treat life not merely as a fleeting accident, but as part of a much larger and mysterious continuum. Conversely, if death truly is the final end, then the preciousness of each moment becomes even more profound, emphasizing the importance of connection, compassion, and purposeful living within the brief window we are given. In either case, the exploration of ideas like quantum immortality serves as a reminder that science is not only a tool for measuring the world, but also a gateway to deeper philosophical reflection, constantly reshaping our understanding of reality and our place within it. As we stand at the frontier of knowledge, uncovering new insights about the universe, the brain, and the fundamental nature of matter, it is likely that our current theories will evolve, be refined, or even replaced by frameworks we cannot yet imagine. Future discoveries may reveal that consciousness is far more resilient than we think, capable of persisting, transforming, or connecting across realities in ways that make today's speculations seem simplistic. Or they may confirm that awareness is inseparably tied to biological life, reinforcing the finality of death and the uniqueness of each individual existence. Until then, concepts like quantum immortality remain suspended between science and imagination, challenging us to expand our thinking while grounding ourselves in the realities we can observe and verify. Perhaps the most profound lesson to take from this exploration is not whether we are immortal across universes, but how deeply intertwined our sense of self is with the mystery of existence itself, and how every attempt to understand consciousness inevitably leads us to confront the limits of human knowledge. In contemplating the possibility that awareness might continue beyond physical death, we are ultimately exploring our own hopes, fears, and longing for continuity, projecting them onto the vast canvas of the cosmos. Whether the universe grants such continuity or not, the fact that we can ask these questions, imagine such possibilities, and seek understanding is itself a remarkable expression of consciousness, a testament to the curious and reflective nature of the human mind. So, as you reflect on quantum immortality, on branching realities, and on the strange dance between probability and experience, consider not only what might happen after death, but how this perspective shapes the way you live now. Does the possibility of endless continuation inspire courage or caution, wonder or unease, hope or skepticism? And how might these feelings influence the choices you make each day? Perhaps the true power of this idea lies not in providing answers about the afterlife, but in encouraging deeper awareness of the present moment, reminding us that existence, whether finite or infinite, is an extraordinary phenomenon, worthy of reflection, respect, and curiosity. And as science continues its relentless quest to uncover the secrets of reality, one thing remains certain: the consciousness, with all its mysteries, will remain at the heart of humanity's greatest questions, guiding us toward ever deeper explorations of what it means to be alive, in a universe that is far stranger and more beautiful than we ever imagined.